Thanks everyone for joining me. This presentation's been rattling around in my head for a while, and so I'm hoping I can put it all together in one place. I'm excited to try this out. So I've been talking about Alaska's energy future. I'll specifically be framing this around Homer Electric Association, our local power grid, the Kenai Peninsula, but it applies in a lot of ways to Alaska as a whole. And so I'll talk a bit about what an energy system is, what I mean by that, and why we need to change the way our energy system works right now. And then I'll get into the details. How do we generate electricity? How do we store electricity? And how do we use it? And how does that all fit together? I want to make this point that there is a possible future, and that's what this presentation is about. One possible future. It's not the only possible future for our energy systems, but I think it's one worth thinking about because it's, I think, one of the most accessible, easiest futures to get to that is also good. And that's what I'm going for. And so there are a lot of details in here, but that's kind of the big picture I want to get to. And I'm going to draw this funny diagram. I'm going to fill this out so those aren't like round heads with fuzzy hairdos. Those are blurred out things that will become clear as we go through the talk. To kind of paint one picture of how we could run an energy system. I think it's really easy to forget how central to our lives and energy systems are. You probably know that we all burn around 1,500, 2,000 calories a day by eating food, digesting it. That's how we walk, that's how we think, that's how we maintain our bodies. You can ask the same question about all the energy we consume outside our bodies, driving our cars, cooking dinner. You can convert all those things from whether kilowatt hours or whatever to calories. And it turns out that the number there is about 800,000 calories a day. So it's really a tiny, tiny percentage of the energy we consume is consumed within our bodies. Most of it is consumed from other energy systems other energy coming in. And it takes a really complicated system to bring all that to us so we have that energy when we need it. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of the big energy systems that surround us. And the first one's fossil fuels. This is the biggest one in the world today. It starts out with production, then we have to do things like refine oil, that sort of thing, move it around, and then eventually we consume that. And it gets to the consumer. So there's this arc from production to consumption there. And we can draw a similar arc for electric energy systems. And so again, we have to produce it whether with fossil fuel power plants, renewables, nuclear power, that sort of thing. We do also have to mess with it after that. We have to get it places. We have to transform it into useful forms, and then we can consume it at the end. And so kind of the idea that I'm going to be exploring today is what if we took away that fossil fuel energy system entirely? And that means not only removing the biggest part of this complicated diagram, but also removing the part where it actually feeds into our electrical system. So it's a huge change to the way the system works right now. And it would be perfectly reasonable to ask how we can even survive without fossil fuels. So before I get to how, I want to talk a little bit about why. I'm just going to address this very briefly. But you probably are aware, fossil fuels, burning them leads to CO2 in the atmosphere. This is why our climate's currently in a state of crisis. We need to act quickly to reduce that while also adapting to the consequences of what we've already done. I'm not going to convince anyone of anything new here today, but I do want to note that when we talk about climate change and our fossil fuel dependence as one of the problems we face in the world today, it's what's sometimes called a wicked problem, which means that our human nature and our human systems are working against us at every turn. And one of the things that I think I'm hoping you get kind of a positive take out of this whole presentation, because I think actually energy system transformation is one of the least wicked parts of this very wicked problem. It's something we can actually do, and we can get it right. And I actually see that as kind of the carrot for us here on the Kenai Peninsula. If we do this right, then we are actually moving away from climate change and the catastrophe that is. There is a stick as well, and that's that most of our energy in Alaska comes from natural gas that comes out of Cook Inlet. And we've been getting natural gas out of Cook Inlet for a long time, and it's running out, which is not to say that literally there's just going to be none left someday, but it means that the economics is getting worse. It's getting more expensive, it's getting less predictable. So natural gas in Cook Inlet is running out. And when you get to that point, if you're heating your home or you're running your power plant on natural gas and the prices go up or you just can't get supply for a time, this is bad. So we don't want to be in that position. We want to get ahead of the game on this. And there's every reason to think that natural gas is not actually our best option. It's not our cheapest option anyway. If we look in the lower 48 where natural gas is actually much cheaper, renewable energy like solar and wind is getting so cheap that it's often outcompeting natural gas, even when you have to buy a new generation plant in order to get it. And if we look around Cook Inlet specifically, and the Kenai Peninsula specifically, the cheapest power we have right now doesn't come from natural gas. It comes from Bradley Hydroelectric Project. It's a big conventional hydro project. It's been around since 1991. And it provides the cheapest electricity we have. And we can actually look at the history of those prices. And what we see is that hydropower from Bradley has actually decreased in cost over time. Most of this is actually due to inflation. The costs have been fairly flat, but the dollar's worth less over time, so it's become cheaper. Natural gas, on the other hand, has increased at, a rate that would be fairly satisfying if it was an investment, over 5% per year increase over this long term here. And it's been a long time since gas was a cheaper way to generate electricity than hydropower. And so we would definitely like to see a future where hydropower would continue to be part of how we generate electricity. We can kind of think about how much electricity might we be generating that way. Right now we're at somewhere around 15%. We actually don't know where we are exactly because we just expanded Bradley a bit. But with some reasonable kind of near-term changes, we could see that going up towards 25%, maybe even 30%. It's challenging to really imagine going a lot beyond that because hydropower is extremely site-specific. There aren't a million options to build hydropower. And part of that is the actual physical constraints that an engineer would be concerned about, and part of it is the environmental impacts. Many places where you put hydropower, you can actually have some pretty big negative effects. So I'm going to start filling out my diagram here. We'll get our first little bit here. We'll think in terms of something like 20% hydro. And I said 25 to 30%, but you'll see why I want to keep it a little low there as we go on here. Now we also have to talk about wind. This is a map of wind potential in our region here, the different colors. The darkest color there is not very good. You don't really want to put wind there. But that next color up is as good as where a lot of wind development is happening in the lower 48. And then the brightest colors are even better than that. So we have a lot of wind potential in this area. And if you're building infrastructure like wind generation, you kind of would rather put it near power lines, which is in orange, or roads, which are in black here. So you kind of want to be thinking about that and thinking about where you might want to put it. And also it's nice to shade out some of the protected land. Not that wind is always inconsistent with the protected status of different lands, but it's certainly easier to develop on unprotected lands. And so you can kind of just look at this map and see a few places that are potentially of interest. Looking just at the Caribou Hills and Bradley Lake near Homer here, that is enough wind generation potential to supply all of HEA's electricity, actually much of the rail belt. So there's a lot of wind power out there. Solar is sort of the grandmommy of renewables. Hydro and wind are just sort of side effects of solar. They're little leftovers, and so there's a tremendous amount of solar energy out there. It's a really attractive option because it's now become incredibly cheap to deploy solar energy, and also because it's relatively predictable. And that predictability actually makes it a really important part of a possible future grid. This is some solar production data from panels in my yard. Each dot represents 1 day of energy production. Didn't put a vertical axis on there. It doesn't matter for what I want to say. But right away you can see there's kind of a pattern here. There's a seasonal pattern where we get a lot more energy in the summer. We get next to nothing in the middle of winter. And you also see a lot of variability at any given time of year, presumably because the amount of clouds vary. There might be a few other factors in there as well. Now, looking at a plot like this, you can kind of get a sense of how much energy we might get from solar without doing anything really extraordinary within our existing grid. And the thought experiment to do is imagine that we built enough solar that, in this case, looked just like the panels in my yard, that we got all of our power for one day on the nicest day in summer from solar. Then how much of our power will we get total through the year? So what you're doing is you're comparing the average to that maximum. And so you could conceivably get something like 30%. Now, there's some big caveats there around storage, and we're going to get there in a minute. But this is probably order of magnitude the kind of energy you could provide using solar power. So if we go and continue filling out our diagram here, we'll be a little bit conservative again and say 20% solar, not 30%, and then fill in the rest with wind. We'll just say wind is abundant, so it's going to take up the slack here. Now, I've obviously alluded to storage already quite a bit. We definitely need to talk about storage, and I think when people think about storing electricity, the first thing they think of is lithium batteries. And actually, HEA has now a giant grid-tied lithium battery, which I don't know whether it's on today or it's going to be on next week or it turned on a week ago, but we're right around now is when they're turning this sucker on. And it's a big battery. It could power the entire HEA grid for an hour or two. Let's call it an hour and a half. Lithium batteries have become a really big part of the conversation about storage that's connected to electric grids. Throughout the United States, they're booming out there because they're a really good battery. They recharge really efficiently. They last a long time. There are some concerns about getting the lithium in order to make them, but they do a lot. And a lot of these lithium facilities, these lithium batteries, are especially appreciated for the fact that they clean up the electric supply. So when electricity is delivered to consumers, it needs to exactly match these very specific specifications of what the frequency and the amount of electricity going out there, and a battery can really help clean that up. Now, we can look back at this diagram and kind of imagine how we might use that storage. Now, I said each of these dots represents a whole day's generation, but if we were to look through a day, of course, it's nighttime. Sometimes we aren't generating anything from solar panels. Sometimes it's the middle of the day. So that generation pattern, the pattern through the day, is not exactly matched to when people want electricity. And so storage can help even that out. We can, when we have an excess in the middle of the day, we can store the energy, and then we can use it through the night when we need it there. And you could get a general sense we might need around half a day of storage in order to do the sort of smoothing that would apply to this solar panels. So if we're talking 12 hours, that's about 8 times what we have right now. So a lot more, but not an unimaginably large amount more. However, one of the challenges here is that wind is much more variable than solar, and so just 12 hours of storage is really probably not going to do it, and 12 hours is already quite a bit to get out of our batteries. So it would be nice if we had some trick where we could get some long-term storage in this system. I think it's worth thinking about how we store energy in the United States today. So this is a pie chart with nothing on it right now. I'll quiz you guys. I will hardly give you any time to answer, but how much of that pie do you think is lithium batteries that are deployed on the grid right now? How much of the US's energy storage is in lithium batteries today?
0.05%.
Very close. 0.07 is where we are. We've gone up a little bit from 0.05. Now, if we added all the other batteries, do you know that number?
1.3.
Less than that, about 0.6, 0.7%, something like that. So we add all the batteries together and we barely touched this pie. So we're clearly missing something, right? I mean, everyone thinks of batteries if they think of storing electricity, but that is apparently not the way we do it. And the way we actually do it in our grid is using something called pumped hydro, or pumped storage hydroelectricity. The way this technology works is you go and you find a mountain or a hill with a body of water next to it. And then you go and you put a reservoir up on top of that. You put a pipeline between, and you put a special turbine on that pipeline and then connect it to the grid. So this turbine looks a lot like a normal hydro turbine, except it can be reversed. You can send electricity into it and use it as a pump and move water from the lower reservoir to the upper reservoir. So when you have an excess of electricity, you can pull the water up the hill, and then when you need it, you can allow it to flow back down. And the reason that when you talk about storage capacity, that this is the dominant technology, and it's not a new technology, so this has been around since 1907. It's also not obsolete. Like some of the major build out of pumped hydro was in 2014, 2015, looking at the total pumped hydro in the US. But the reason that this shows up so much is that while building something that looks just like the lithium battery that HEA has now would be fairly expensive, it might be competitive, it might not, depends on all the details. If you keep expanding the amount of storage, all you're doing is building that upper reservoir to be a little bit bigger. You find the right geometry, that might not be very expensive. And so you can actually get to a lot of storage. You can get to many hours, days, weeks, even months of storage in a pumped hydro facility. So this is something that can actually deal with that long-term storage issue. So now if we start to keep working on filling out our diagram here, I picked some numbers. I will confess this is not the sort of analysis you would want to see, which involves like second-by-second variations from all these generation and consumption sources. But I think that this gives us some sense of what we might want to have here. Something like 6 hours of battery storage, about 4 times what we have now. Something like 2 weeks of pumped storage hydro. Those might be, the sort of analysis that you'd want to do is one we absolutely should do. HEA should be doing this today, I think, to get those numbers much more refined than what I have here. Now we've gotten to 100% renewable grid, and so it might be attractive to just go home now. This is great. We were 100%, sounds really good. But the problem is that actually most of the fossil fuels we consume, we don't consume in order to generate electricity. A lot of our energy goes to heating homes and to transportation. Some other things too, but those are the 2 really big ones. So we have to address those as well. And I'll start out with heating. So there's good news and bad news here. So the good news is heat is really easy to make. You can actually just light some sticks you find on the ground on fire. If I took an axe and went into the wall of this building and found a couple of wires and just joined them together, maybe I'd have to shove a penny into the breaker box first, I would generate heat at 100% efficiency. It'd be a really good way to generate heat. It would be in all the wires in the house would catch on fire. It wouldn't be good in that way, but I could put a wire in there instead that has a specific resistance, and then I can control where and how much heat is produced. So generating heat with electricity is super easy. The problem is that heat, it takes a lot of energy to produce enough heat to make a building comfortable. It takes about 5 times as much energy as all of our electricity consumption in order to heat all the buildings. And so this presents a real challenge. That's a tremendous amount of energy to be getting out of electricity. And it would be nice if there was a trick, and it turns out there is a trick. And that's that we not only can we create heat from whole cloth by consuming electricity, we can also pump it around. We can find heat in places and move it where we want it. And this sounds a little bit crazy, but it is exactly what we do with air conditioners and freezers. And I think it's worth just pausing for a moment and picturing what happens when you take a cold, like take it out of your ice box, out of a cooler. You have a fillet of salmon, you put it in your freezer and it freezes. What happens there? So that freezer is this appliance that's going to remove the heat that was in that cold slab of salmon, and it has to put it somewhere. You can't just destroy energy. The closest thing you do to destroying energy just makes it into heat. Well, it has to move that heat somewhere else. It moves it into your house. So you're actually warming your house up by cooling a cold piece of salmon. And so this is heat pumps, and heat pumps have gotten very efficient in recent years, and they actually are now a completely practical way to heat your home. You can actually pull heat from the cold air outside, bring it inside your house, and warm the house up. This is standard technology in some places. In Scandinavia, even in areas of Alaska. Here on the Kenai Peninsula, it's actually quite prevalent in Seward at this point. They're starting to really develop it there. So this provides a really attractive solution. And then instead of 5 times as much, you need we're only going to need to double our electricity supply. Still a big step, but it's much more doable. Now, at this point, transportation may sound like the easiest problem I have to talk about all day. We know that electric cars are super popular. It's not a huge leap of imagination that we put this very similar technology into small boats, into air taxis, this sort of thing. And I do think we're headed in that direction. We should move that direction as quickly as we can. But there is a caveat, and that's that long-haul transportation is really difficult. And that's the only thing that I'm going to bring up in the whole arc of this presentation that is more in the realm of experimental technologies rather than something that is established and widely deployed in the economy and the energy systems today. We do have ideas of how to do that, even how to get, say, fuel for long-haul transportation from electricity, but none of these are standard technology yet. But if we did get our energy for transportation from the electric grid, that's going to tack on a bit more. It's not as much as heat. We've gone through and put together this picture of what our energy system might look like if we got all together on this. And it's been kind of complicated and messy in some ways. I can imagine that there's many things you might be thinking of that are left out. I do want to hit one thing that's kind of glossed over in this, and that's that I explained a electric grid based on our current demand, and I came up with the stuff on the left. And then I went and more than doubled the demand at the end. And so we do have to deal with that little problem. Hydro is probably the hardest piece of that because, as I mentioned, we can't necessarily site hydro wherever we want, so the amount of hydropower is limited. I said maybe we can get to 30% on our current grid, so maybe it's going to end up being like 15 after we increase our demand, or maybe we find a bit more and we get to 20. Solar we can scale mostly with increased demand, and wind we can do that as well, as long as our storage is also planned out from the start to be for a system that is going to have all of this additional demand. So that's a key point. We don't want to be so focused on our 100% renewable grid that we forget that grid is going to ultimately have to be a lot bigger. And I think it's worth just shoving things over a little bit and making just a bit more room for the smart grid on here. Because especially as we see heating and transportation become big demands on our electric grid, having different smart grid technologies, including technologies that are actually being widely experimented with in Alaska, especially on our microgrids that are out in remote Alaska, where the cost of energy is so high that they're super motivated to try all these experimental things. Smart grids are an established technology at that level. Some things have never been tried, but there are a lot of things that have, and they could really help kind of resolve any rickety parts in this whole picture. All right, so I will leave it there with Einstein and his lightning bolt tattoo, and I would be really happy to take any questions you have.
I really don't know what a smart grid is.
Sure. Yeah, so a good example of something that's been around for a long time is if you have generation that you can't control real well, it's going to be, this renewables have this issue. You're going to have generation when you have generation. Then one thing you can do is you can actually let the utility run your water heater. The utility can say, well, as long as you're willing to take that water heating electricity whenever we feel like giving it to you, we'll give it to you really cheap. So that gives you a market for these peaks in production that you maybe otherwise can't use. So that would be an example of a smart grid kind of application. A lot of people often talk about variable pricing, and there are a bunch of cool things you could do with that. So you could maybe have your car with your electric battery sitting in the garage, and it would be all night. It'd be like it's on the stock market. It's like discharging electricity to the grid and then taking electricity back, and it's based on this complex pricing model and stuff. Some of those have a lot of potential, but there are much, much simpler things that we're doing already that actually really help solve a lot of these complicated problems of making the connection between supply and demand. Other questions?
Go ahead. Well, I'm wondering, a lot of these things that you're talking about, you're kind of discussing as if HEA should take them on. But in the lower 48, we've seen where actually private companies can come in and, for example, develop a solar panel rental system where the industry therefore has to deal with a whole bunch of renewable energy suddenly on their grid. Or, for example, if heat pumps come in and a really good heat pump seller comes in and starts selling a bunch of heat pumps, then suddenly demand raises, and yet this kind of infrastructure hasn't been built. How much of this do you see landing on HEA or just happening whether HEA develops any plan or not?
I think it's a good question. I think that there are a bunch of different pieces to that. So one of them, I think, is generation specifically. And I think that utility scale generation is something we definitely don't want to lose sight of. It's great to have solar panels all over your house. Good to be doing that. But in order to really get where we need to go, we need to have things that are utility scale. That doesn't mean the utility has to build it. And actually, we have a proposal right now that is sort of collectively being considered by the Kenai Peninsula for a big solar farm that would be run by a private company based up on Wasilla, and that would provide like 6.5% of our electricity from solar. Be a huge step, and I think it'd be really great if we see that happen. And there are big advantages to having those private companies coming in. They have different access to capital, which is a big limitation for a utility, is to actually have the capital to build something out. And they just have, the private industry just works different. It's good to have a variety of different things going on there. So that's on the generation end. Now the consumption end, things like heat pumps and such, I think HEA should be encouraging this, and I think we're really close to this. There's actually, it looks like there'll be a little pilot program towards encouraging, providing rebates for heat pumps. I think that'd be great, but HEA isn't really in the driver's seat there. It's ultimately individual homeowners making that decision, and then the businesses that need to be able to provide those services. And one of the big limitations we have right here, right now, is that the HVAC part of installing air source heat pumps or heat pumps of any kind it's hard to get people with that expertise to do that. And so that's something that actually they're much further along in Seward than they are here in Homer. So I think these are soluble problems that we actually need to get on solving them. That's at least a partial answer to Scott.
What kind of improvements do we need to make to our grid overall, stretching between Homer and Fairbanks, to be able to economically dispatch power where it's needed, when it's needed?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of cases where transmission becomes a limitation, and that comes up. I think the biggest conversation there is the largest scale of transmission, so transmission across the whole rail belt, and there's a lot of interest in solving those. And so one example of why that would be important, so I kind of painted this picture from a HEA-centric, Kenai Peninsula-centric perspective. It'd be nice to be talking about the whole rail belt. And actually, we have really good renewable resources here, renewable generation, electricity generation resources here on the Kenai Peninsula. That could be benefiting people further up the rail belt, where in some cases they don't have as many options. But the big barrier to that is transmission. Right now, all the transmission is basically plugged going north with Bradley power. And so we can't just put a bunch of additional renewable transmission. And in fact, even the battery that HEA is getting, all of a sudden the grid can't handle it. So we do have to be, alert to that sort of issue as well.
You have notably left off tidal and geothermal, and is it just that they're too far away to be happening now, or is there another concern?
Yeah, basically. That's basically what I'd say is that I actually think tidal especially really hope that we will see tidal be a big part of, that if we were to draw the real diagram in 40 years, that tidal would be a big chunk of that. But it is an experimental technology at this point. And I think it's really important to know that we don't need it. We shouldn't be sitting around waiting for tidal. We should be building out like this as quickly as we can. And with that increase in demand that we would expect through this, it's very likely that if tidal like started catching up, that wouldn't be a problem. It's not like we're going to have, you know, no place for generation from tidal. I think we would see it. You know, and geothermal, very site specific. If we can get it, let's get it. I mean, deep geothermal, still very experimental. Nuclear, micro nukes and that sort of thing, very experimental. Maybe we'll see it in Alaska. You know, obviously there's some potential concerns there too. But by focusing on this set of technologies, these are all things that are totally off the shelf. And I think that's a big plus.
Well, I'd be remiss not to ask this question, because I feel like if you go to a mining conference, you know, the best argument for open pit mining is climate change, and you know, so we're going to need more minerals. So as we, you know, is this a potential scenario where you know, lesser of two evils, or robbing Peter to pay Paul? Like, what do you think about the, you know, the externalities of needing all the new inputs of?
I think that's, yeah, it's a really difficult question. So you look at something like Pebble, like would supply a lot of copper if we're going to improve transmission, or, you know, a lot of these things, ultimately there's copper going in there. One of the things that I struggle with in trying to understand what the answer to that question is how politicized that becomes, because there are very political perspectives that can paint it either direction. And it's a complicated economic question of exactly what the benefits are to moving towards, you know, a decarbonized world of, say, developing a big copper mine. I think these questions maybe get even more complicated in some ways if you start looking at less fungible resources. So with copper, you know, you get copper from Pebble, you get it from somewhere else, all same difference. It's just a question of where you're getting it. Something like graphite is not the same from place to place. And we have a huge graphite prospect up by Nome in Alaska. And, you know, it's even more difficult to assess the argument like, hey, we need graphite for the energy transition. Maybe a very valid argument. And I don't feel like I can fully assess that. But I do think it's worth having that conversation and asking that question. I think it's a valid question to ask, that, you know, there are economic concepts like displacement and all this sort of thing that you really, I think that if one is thinking sort of in the mode of an environmentalist, for instance, like, it is good to say, okay, there really is processes of displacement. So if you build a mine in one place, or you don't build that if you choose not to build it, then that might increase mining somewhere else. Those are real economic dynamics that exist. And so I think you're remiss if you don't at least acknowledge those and consider their potential implications.
So we've got a system where we can draw natural gas out of Cook Inlet pretty easily. It's been in place for 60 years. Prices may be kind of high, but why don't we just continue on with doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, the climate end of this is, I mean, just any natural gas we burn, it's becoming CO2 in the atmosphere. That's the simplest piece. But natural gas also, what we've found is that the extraction and delivery of natural gas is a leaky process, and natural gas is predominantly methane, which has a disproportionate climate impact. So there are reasons that we don't want to do any more using of natural gas just for the sake of the climate. And if you set that aside and you think about the economics are really pretty bad. Like, I mean, we've been seeing prices rising on natural gas production really steadily. We've also seen Fury had a contract to deliver gas to our electric utility, and they reneged on the contract because they just couldn't produce enough natural gas. This sort of thing, like, we really are not in a good place, and this is not controversial. Like, if you look at some of the state analysis of what needs to happen for us to continue having natural gas going to NSTAR and to HEA, to the different big consumers, they predict that prices have to keep climbing and climb quite high. This is also the implications that are underlying some of the the current BOEM analyses for natural gas extraction in Cook Inlet. It's really not a good situation economically, even if we ignore the climate impacts, which I don't think we should do.
Another off-the-shelf technology that you didn't really talk about much, and I assume it's because it's hard to measure, like in a big economic analysis like that, is efficiency. And improving that.
Well, you know, I think probably the one thing that would really be great to insert into this picture is home insulation. That's a efficiency improvement that is such a huge win. But yeah, there are a bunch of wrinkles to that. One is, I mean, you know, so let's set home efficiency aside for a minute, because I think that one is just absolutely defensible, important piece of this, and could really help, you know, make it an easier path. A lot of efficiency improvements end up being really difficult to implement as policy to actually lead to an ends like we're talking about, like ending the consumption of fossil fuels. Behaviorally, people tend to shift their consumption elsewhere if their costs drop because they became more efficient. Another really interesting piece of this is that we actually have gotten more efficient about our electricity consumption. I think LED lighting is a huge piece of that, but there are other things as well. And it actually puts the utilities in a bit of a bind as far as actually building out renewables. Now, that's not a reason that we should put incandescent lights back. That would be a terrible idea. But it's the reducing demand creates a economic puzzle for switching how we generate the electricity. And so that's one place where you just really have to think about all the different pieces of that puzzle before it's clear where to put your energy, I guess.
How much of that difficulty in creating efficiency is because you have to do it on a building by building basis rather than one big project?
I mean, you know, we're going more into your expertise than mine here, but I would say it is significant there. You know, like there are things like the, you know, various incentives and stuff are a way to, you know, kind of upscale, you know, efficiency improvement. And people talk a lot about that, and we've seen some good examples of that actually being executed by the government, where we put incentives in place for people to actually make more efficient homes. But yeah, it does ultimately depend on the decisions of each individual homeowner, and that's a really complicated landscape to navigate. It'd be nice if that was going on, and we were 100% renewable in our generation, and people, you know, I think one of the pieces that you know, is a simple thing to get out there to homeowners that I really hope will become kind of mainstream knowledge, but I don't think we're there yet, is really don't hook up to natural gas right now. If you aren't hooked up to natural gas already, don't do it now. Like, this is a step in the wrong direction, and even if the economics look okay right now, they probably aren't going to be over the long term. So I really think that that anyone who's in that position of deciding how to heat their home, natural gas shouldn't be their first choice.
I had never heard of pumped hydro as a way that energy can be stored. It seems like Alaska would have great opportunity to store electricity that way, because we have so many mountains and so many places that might be reasonably easy to do something like that. Plus, I would think that stored electricity that way could be available all year round, including winter. So you pump the water in the summertime when you've got the solar power or whatever, and then drain the lake in the wintertime when you need the extra power. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the right idea. You know, I think another upside is that, like, it involves like bulldozers and laying pipe, which is something we know how to do in Alaska, rather than lithium, which we don't have, you know, and lithium battery factories. But no, I think it's got a, you know, huge potential, and there's some really good ideas out there. Kerry Williams is someone who's really put a lot of thought into how Alaska might actually do some of this. It is not a mainstream idea right now in the Alaska energy world, and it's I think it deserves a lot more sort of study and consideration than it's gotten so far. Partly, I think there's a hesitation because anytime you're going towards hydro, you end up with very complicated. Well, the engineering is pretty complicated, but then the regulatory environment is really complicated. So you have to deal with FERC and all of those, the complicated sort of federal regulations and such. That said, there's some huge potential there, and I really hope that we recognize that complexity. We start making plans, taking steps today, even if it is going to take us 10 years to have something actually operational. One of the things I think is really exciting about pumped hydro is so normal hydro, you're intercepting some big river or something, all of this flow, which an engineer looks at and looks like, oh, there's a bunch of energy, let's get some of that. But rivers are also these huge, they have these huge ecological implications. And so if you intersect that ecologically important river, you're probably going to have an ecological effect. You can do your best to minimize that. You can be really selective about where you do it. But there are ultimately, you're stepping into the functioning of the ecosystem to a large degree. Because pumped hydro is moving water between these two fairly closed little bodies of water, it doesn't have that implication. And you can actually even turn it around and look at, we have concerns about drought and about heat stress events in salmon streams especially. You could actually manage your pumped hydro resource to try to mitigate some of those effects. That's got some exciting possibilities in Alaska, I think. So I really hope we see pumped hydro being a bigger piece of the conversation.
And what are the potential pumped hydro sites on the Kenai Peninsula?
So the one that I know Carrie has analyzed is a place called Wright Mountain. It's up in the kind of as you go into the mountains, going up the highway towards Anchorage. It's kind of like my little cartoon there. There's a nice kind of a semi-enclosed bowl up high where you could a fairly small dam would impound a fairly large volume of water, and there's water access down at the bottom. One of the ones I've wondered about, and I've talked to Carrie some about this myself, is over in Namwalik. They have issues with their system of lakes there. It's really part of the reason the village is there is because there's this awesome salmon run there. Well, in 2019, with our big drought year, those rivers started showing signs of heat and drought stress. It became kind of something you could imagine that there would be a crisis for that salmon population. They have these really high relief mountains right around there, and they also have a huge wind resource. Now they aren't really close to our current grid, so it's pretty expensive there's a long distribution line that goes out there. But as far as providing a lot of electricity to the grid, it's not an easy place to do that. But if we were to actually get to the point of energy export, either just out of the Kenai Peninsula to the rest of the rail belt, or even export in the form of hydrogen or ammonia or aluminum that would be going out of Alaska entirely, then Namwalik is. I would love to talk with someone there about whether this is something they have any interest in whatsoever. But they might be able to have this win-win where they have this huge economic resource and also a chance to kind of protect their subsistence resource right in their own backyard there.
Is there any potential to expand Bradley with pumped hydro?
Yeah, that's been discussed to some extent. You need the lower water source, and it's not totally clear what spot you would use for that. But you could use Bradley itself as the upper reservoir. You could also use it as a lower reservoir and build something up higher. But that's a little bit more of a jump because you would have to move more infrastructure further up into the more difficult to reach places. But I think it's something it's an obvious question to ask. I guess we could say that much. And I think it'd be worth considering.
When you talk about, well, maybe back up, over my lifespan, a lot of renewables have, the language has shifted from clean energy to a different term because we know that there is impacts. We know hydro, and we in Alaska rely heavily on salmon, and obviously salmon don't do well with dams. We see that in the Pacific Northwest. Bats don't do well with our wind power. You see that across the country. Even I just read a study on offshore wind farms killing bats. And then you see it with solar farms having really serious problems for, you know, other environmental impacts with small mammals and other things like that. And I guess most of those I've seen in Arizona and those areas. But when you talk about using in industry, really using it not as using it where we are already in infrastructure, how do we mitigate those costs to our environment, to many things that we do care about? And Wallach would obviously be very concerned if we try to do something to take out their salmon runs.
Yeah, I mean, these are huge questions. Like, and I think, I mean, one of my, so just personally, like one of the experiences I've had over the last 10 years or so is I've worked, you know, really closely with some environmental opposition to development at Pebble and other things. And I've seen that side of the conversation and how frustrating it can be to be dealing with an industry that has an idea and doesn't, you know, is really trying to find some way of just sweeping another perspective under the rug. And I've also been in the position, you know, of advocating for a project and then having environmentalists come out and say, hey, wait, we don't want to see anything like this. And the question for me is, how do we actually have that conversation successfully? You know, how do we actually consider those impacts honestly and completely and use that to guide our decisions without having it just like the, you know, a battle of attrition between two extremes. And one of the things that I think for the environmental side of that discussion that I think it's important to have this in the back of our minds as environmentalists is, you know, that no action is not a good option either. You know, no action is like you go and hang out in Upper Cook Inlet. You can be anywhere in these hundreds and hundreds of square miles, and what you'll be hearing is the roar of fossil fuel extraction platforms. You know, flares lighting up the night. Like, it's very dramatic to be in Trading Bay and to see that. That's what, you know, we have right now. And if we don't do something else, then we continue to have that until maybe an economic crisis of some sort shuts it all down. So we're not in a good position where we can just have a win-win-win-win solution. But I do think, like, if we look at particular impacts, those can actually be measured, and we can, you know, we can, or not necessarily measured, in a lot of cases we're talking modeled or estimated because we're talking about future impacts. But we can work to look at different options and how do we balance these out and pick something that is sort of feasible within existing systems and also gets as close as we can to minimizing those impacts while recognizing that they're not going to be zero.
On the new infrastructure dollars coming to Alaska, have any of those been allocated towards renewables and upgrading our grid? And do you know, is it still a fuzzy thing, or are they very specific?
Yeah, I don't know really deep details there, but my understanding is that yes, some, but this is not a, you know, renewables focused kind of thing. A lot more of it is, you know, broadband and roads and bridges and stuff. But there are some pieces in there. I think one of the most interesting things I saw in the summary I was reading is that there's talk of a low emission or electrical ferry pilot project, and I think that would be, I really would like to see some, you know, electric boat and electric plane experimentation happening in Alaska as soon as possible. And so if it spurs some of that forward, I think that'll be a really positive thing, because ultimately you have to try these things and yeah, who is it that's going to try them out? It's nice when the federal government can come in and say, here's a huge pile of money, let's just give it a shot. But, you know, in some of these cases, I think it's going to come more to us to figure out how to try the experiments.
Regarding pumped hydro storage, do the identified opportunities or speculated opportunities come close to meeting meaning the amount that we need in your model?
Yes, yeah, and so I think we can say yeah to that one. So that, you know, Carrie's the only one I know of who's really gotten all the way to the point of actually trying to add things up in that way. And I know his Right Mountain prospect was sized to be actually allow HEA's grid to be islanded, and so that would be the yes answer to your question very specifically. I think more broadly, I'm optimistic that we could do quite well as far as having enough storage with the geographic constraints we have in Alaska using pumped hydro.